November 1, 1944. Musashino, Tama River District, Greater Tokyo. Altitude, 32,000 feet above sea level. The air temperature outside the aircraft's skin reads -57 degrees Celsius. Below, the lights of the Japanese capital shimmer through the overcast, indifferent and ancient, and utterly unaware of what is coming. On the ground, Sergeant Kenji Watanabe of the 1st Air Defense Regiment, stationed at the Tachikawa Sector warning post, tilts his binoculars skyward. He has been tracking aircraft sounds for 11 seconds. Something is wrong. The sound is enormous, not the thin buzz of a B-24 or the clipped throb of a B-17 he has studied from captured intelligence films. This is different. A low, bone-shaking thunder, multiple engines, perfectly synchronized, closer than they should be before he heard them. I heard it before I could see it, and I was afraid. Not of danger. I was afraid because I did not know what it was. That is a different kind of fear entirely. Sergeant Kenji Watanabe, post-war interview, Tokyo, 1949. Through his binoculars, Sergeant Watanabe finally resolves the shape in the moonlight breaking through the clouds. It is vast. The wingspan is absurd. He has never seen anything so large in the air. The 4 engines leave no vapor trail at this altitude. Just dark, silent, enormous shapes moving in a line. He counts them. He stops counting at 12. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, arrives at the post and examines the radar trace. The aircraft are at altitude his fighters cannot reliably reach. They are moving at over 350 kilometers per hour. They are enormous. And there are dozens of them. Lieutenant Tanaka consults his intelligence briefing file, a thin document, 6 pages stamped with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force intelligence crest. He finds the entry. He reads aloud to his men, and his voice carries the absolute confidence of a man who has studied his enemy. This aircraft is a propaganda weapon. The Americans have given it a grand name, the Superfortress, but our intelligence confirms that it is structurally fragile, prone to engine fires, difficult to control, and its crews are undertrained. It cannot sustain combat. It is a paper dragon. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, reading from Imperial Japanese Army Air Force Intelligence Assessment number 7734, B, dated October 12, 1944. He closed the file. Around him, his men nodded, reassured. In the searchlights above, the B-29s moved in a steady, terrible procession, indifferent to the flak beginning to crack and bloom far below their altitude. The paper dragon was already over Tokyo, and Lieutenant Tanaka would spend the next 8 months learning exactly how wrong his intelligence file was. This is the story of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most expensive weapons program in American history. The aircraft that ended the Second World War, the machine that made the impossible not just possible, but systematic, industrial, and unstoppable. To understand why the B-29 existed, you have to understand the terror that gripped American military planners in the last months of 1940. Britain was fighting alone. The Atlantic was a killing ground for German submarines. The Pacific Fleet was concentrated at Pearl Harbor, a single catastrophic strike away from crippling. And in Europe, Germany's Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt fighters were shredding British bombers over the continent. American war planners, watching from the sidelines, reached a conclusion that was simultaneously visionary and desperate. If America was drawn into this war, she would need a bomber that could strike from distances so great that no known fighter could intercept it. A bomber that could cross oceans, that could operate above the ceiling of any anti-aircraft gun then in existence, that could carry enough ordnance to destroy an entire industrial complex in a single mission. In January 1940, the United States Army Air Corps issued a specification, Requirement XB-29. They needed an aircraft with a range of 5,333 miles, a bomb load of 2,000 pounds over that range, scalable to 20,000 pounds for shorter missions, a top speed of at least 400 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 35,000 feet, higher than any production aircraft had ever flown in sustained combat. And they needed it within 4 years. 4 companies submitted proposals: Consolidated, Douglas, Lockheed, and Boeing. The Boeing design, submitted by a team led by Chief Engineer Edward Curtis Wells, a 30-year-old aeronautical engineer from Springfield, Ohio, who had already designed the B-17 Flying Fortress, was the most audacious. Wells proposed not just a bigger bomber, but a fundamentally different kind of aircraft. A pressurized, remotely controlled, long-range strategic weapon, unlike anything that had ever taken to the skies. We were not designing an airplane. We were designing a weapons system. Every component, the pressurization, the remote gun stations, the fire control computers, it was all integrated from the start. We knew that if any one of those systems failed, the whole thing failed. The pressure was unlike anything I had experienced. Edward Curtis Wells, Boeing chief engineer, interview for the Boeing Company Archives, 1963. Wells's team worked around the clock at Boeing's Seattle facility, on East Marginal Way, a sprawling complex that would eventually become the largest manufacturing building in the world by volume. The design incorporated 56,000 individual engineering drawings, more documentation than had ever been produced for a single aircraft in history. The pressurized fuselage alone represented a quantum leap. No combat aircraft had ever maintained a livable cabin atmosphere at 30,000 feet. The B-29 would do it across a tube of aluminum 99 feet long. The prototype, XB-29, serial 41002, rolled out of the Boeing plant at Renton, Washington on September 1, 1942. The statistics against its predecessor, the B-17, were staggering. The B-17G Flying Fortress, wingspan 103 feet 9 inches, range 3,750 miles, ceiling 35,600 feet, bomb load 17,600 pounds maximum, top speed 287 miles per hour, crew of 10. The XB-29 Superfortress, wingspan 141 feet 3 inches, range 5,600 miles, ceiling 33,600 feet operational, 38,000 feet absolute, bomb load 20,000 pounds maximum, top speed 357 miles per hour, crew of 11 operating in pressurized comfort at altitude. Even the men who built it were uncertain it would fly. Edmund T. Allen, Boeing's legendary chief test pilot, a man who had flown every major American aircraft of the previous decade, approached the XB-29's first flight with characteristic understatement. There are approximately 900 ways this aircraft could kill you on any given flight. I have identified 347 of them personally. I intend to find the rest before anyone else has to. Edmund T. Allen, Boeing test pilot, remarks to the XB-29 test crew, September 20, 1942. Allen's caution was prescient. The Wright R-3500 duplex Cyclone engines, 4 of them, each producing 2,200 horsepower at takeoff, the most powerful air-cooled radial engines ever mounted on a production aircraft, ran dangerously hot. The engine nacelle cooling design was inadequate for the power output. On February 18, 1943, during the XB-29's second series of test flights, engine number 1 caught fire at altitude. Allen and his crew of 10 died when the aircraft crashed into the Fry packing plant in Seattle, killing 22 people on the ground. It was the worst test flight disaster in American aviation history to that point. The program could have died there. Instead, the Army Air Forces issued an extraordinary order. Full production would proceed even as the design problems were being solved. 3 factories, billions of dollars, an aircraft that hadn't finished its test program. General Henry Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, had staked the entire strategic bombing doctrine of the Pacific War on this machine. There was no going back. Section 3. Early combat failures. The B-29's entry into combat was, by almost every measure, a disaster. The aircraft that arrived in India in April 1944, assigned to the XF Bomber Command under Brigadier General Kenneth B. Wolfe, was a machine plagued by problems that its accelerated development had failed to resolve. The R-3300 engines overheated chronically. Pilots reported that simply climbing to cruise altitude on a hot Indian day could cause cylinder head temperatures to spike dangerously. Engine fires, the same nightmare that had killed Eddie Allen, were a constant threat. In the first 3 months of B-29 operations, more aircraft were lost to mechanical failure than to enemy action. The first operational mission, Mission 1 of the 2X Bomber Command, launched June 5, 1944. 98 B-29s took off from bases around Kharagpur, India, targeting the railway shops at Bangkok, Thailand. It was supposed to demonstrate American air power to the world. Instead, it demonstrated the aircraft's fragility. 5 B-29s were lost to mechanical failure. 42 turned back early with engine problems. Only 77 reached the target area, and of those, the bombing accuracy was poor. Less than 18% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the aiming point. The Japanese followed these early missions with carefully understated satisfaction. Imperial Japanese Army Air Force intelligence officer Major Takeo Oyama compiled the assessments from the first 6 months of B-29 operations and forwarded them to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The B-29, which the Americans call their Superfortress, has revealed itself to be an aircraft of great size but limited effectiveness. Its engines are unreliable. Its bombing accuracy is poor. Our fighter units reported as vulnerable to head-on attacks, and our pilots confirm that the pressurized cabin is a weakness. A single cannon round into the fuselage can compromise the entire system. We assess that this aircraft will not significantly threaten the home islands. Major Takeo Oyama, Imperial Japanese Army Air Force Intelligence, Assessment Report 8821-C, August 15, 1944. Major Oyama was, on the surface, supported by the statistics. In the first 8 B-29 raids conducted from India and China against Japanese targets, Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire accounted for 14 B-29s destroyed and 48 damaged. In return, the B-29s claimed 22 Japanese fighters destroyed, a kill ratio of roughly 1.57 to 1, barely favoring the Americans, and dismal for an aircraft of such enormous cost and theoretical capability. But Major Oyama's report contained a critical error, the same error Lieutenant Tanaka would make from his guard post in Tokyo months later. He was measuring the B-29 against what it was, not against what it was becoming, and deep in the Boeing factories, in the Wichita modification centers, and in the offices of one General Curtis LeMay, the Superfortress was being reinvented entirely. The hidden strength that the Japanese hadn't noticed was not structural. It was organizational. The American industrial machine, already producing more aircraft in a month than Japan produced in a year, was treating the B-29's problems as engineering challenges to be solved systematically, not as evidence of fundamental failure. Each crashed aircraft, each mechanical failure, each abort was fed back into a modification pipeline that was continuously, relentlessly improving the machine. Japan had no equivalent process. Its fighters, brilliant in 1941, were still fundamentally the same aircraft in 1944. The gap was not just technological, it was institutional. Section 4, The Turning Point, January 27, 1945. 30,000 feet over the Kanto Plain, 60 miles northeast of Tokyo. Aircraft Rover Boys Express, B-29, 45BW, serial number 42-24761, piloted by Captain Raymond Halloran of the 73rd Bomb Wing, 498th Bomb Group. The target was the Musashino aircraft engine plant on the outskirts of Tokyo, one of the most heavily defended targets in Japan. Halloran's crew had flown 11 missions. This was their 12th. At 10:34 in the morning, on the final approach to the initial point, a Nakajima-Ki 44 Shoki interceptor, flown by Sergeant Fumio Kato of the 47th Sentai, 3rd Chutai, came in from 12 o'clock high at a closing speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. Kato was executing what Japanese pilots had discovered was the only reliable attack profile against the B-29, a head-on dive, guns firing, trusting speed to carry him through the bomber formation before the remote-controlled gun turrets could track. Kato's cannon rounds warped across the nose of Rover Boys Express in a tight line. The first hit destroyed the Norden bomb site. The second blew through the pressurized nose compartment, instantly flooding it with air at -40 degrees Celsius. The third round struck the No. 3 engine, which immediately began streaming oil. The fourth, and most devastating, struck the forward bomb bay bulkhead, blowing a hole in the fuselage skin 18 inches wide. Halloran's co-pilot, First Lieutenant Donald J. Mina, was struck by fragments and temporarily blinded in his right eye. The bombardier, Second Lieutenant Richard Gorham had his left hand shattered by a fragment that punched through the side of his seat. The nose gunner, Sergeant Arthur Wilson, was knocked unconscious by the pressure differential. The aircraft nosed down sharply, losing 4,000 feet in seconds before Halloran brought it back under control. We had a hole in the nose you could put a man through. The temperature in the front compartment dropped to something I cannot describe. My instruments were fogged. Number 3 was losing power by the second. Dick Gorham was bleeding badly, and we still had 40 minutes of flight over Japan before we could think about the ocean. I remember thinking, this airplane is going to get us home. I didn't know why I thought that. I just did. Captain Raymond Halloran, interview for the 73rd Bomb Wing Historical Record, March 1945. Cato, watching from above, made a second pass and saw the stricken B-29 still flying. He made a third. He exhausted his cannon ammunition firing at the aircraft and was forced to break off. His combat report, filed 2 hours later, expressed something between frustration and genuine bewilderment. I placed at least 4 direct cannon hits on this aircraft. By any calculation, it should have gone down. The front of the aircraft was visibly destroyed. One engine was failing. It continued to fly. I do not understand how this was possible. Sergeant Fumio Kato, 47th Sentai Combat Report, January 27, 1945. Halloran flew Rover Boys Express across 1,500 miles of open Pacific Ocean on 3 engines, with a gaping hole in the pressurized nose, a partially incapacitated crew, and a fuel load that his flight engineer calculated was mathematically insufficient for the distance. He landed at Saipan's Isley Field at 4:17 in the afternoon. The aircraft required 847 individual repairs before it could fly again. When Boeing's field service representatives examined the aircraft, they confirmed what Halloran's crew had already felt. The B-29's fuselage, constructed from 2024 T3 aluminum alloy in a semi-monocoque design, had an extraordinary capacity to absorb and redistribute structural damage. The aircraft was not simply strong, it was specifically engineered to survive catastrophic hits and remain flyable, a design philosophy Wells's team had incorporated deliberately based on hard-won lessons from B-17 combat in Europe. Section 5. Tactical Evolution. The man who broke the B-29's tactical deadlock was not a gentleman. Curtis Emerson LeMay was 38 years old in January 1945, when General Hap Arnold replaced the cautious Hayward Hansel as commander of the Tuareg 1 Bomber Command in the Marianas. LeMay had come up through the European theatre commanding B-17 groups, and he had learned in the cold skies over Germany that doctrine, no matter how carefully designed, was worthless against the reality of combat. What LeMay found when he arrived in the Marianas was an operation flying high-altitude, daylight precision missions against Japanese industrial targets, and achieving almost nothing. The jet stream at 30,000 feet over Japan was a natural phenomenon American meteorologists had not fully accounted for. Winds of 150 miles per hour or more were scattering bombs across miles of territory. The industrial results were negligible. Japan's war production was continuing. LeMay studied his options for less than 3 weeks. On February 19, 1945, he issued his new tactical doctrine in a brief, characteristically blunt operations order. We are going in low, night, below the jet stream. We are going to use incendiaries, not high explosives. The Japanese build with wood. We are going to burn them out. I know the losses will be higher at lower altitude. I'm prepared to accept that. We are going to end this war from the air, or we are going to die trying. Major General Curtis LeMay, XX-01 Bomber Command Operations Directive, February 19, 1945. The doctrine was breathtaking in its simplicity and its ruthlessness. Instead of 30,000 feet, the B-29s would attack at between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, well below the effective ceiling of Japanese anti-aircraft artillery's most accurate band, which was calibrated for higher altitude attacks. They would fly at night, when Japanese radar was less effective. They would carry no defensive ammunition to save weight, increasing bomb loads dramatically. And they would carry M69 incendiary clusters, a 6.2-pound individual bomblet filled with napalm, designed specifically to ignite the paper, bamboo, and wood construction of Japanese urban and industrial areas. His own staff protested. Flying low and slow over Tokyo without ammunition was tantamount to suicide, they said. LeMay is reported to have responded that if the mission failed, he expected to be court-martialed. He scheduled the first test of the new doctrine for March 9, 1945. The first Japanese pilot to encounter LeMay's evolved tactics was Warrant Officer Saburo Saito of the 10th Air Division, flying a Kawasaki Ki 61 Hien out of Chofu Aerodrome on the night of March 9 to 10th. He had been scrambled to intercept the incoming B-29s and expected to find them at their usual altitude. What he found instead disoriented him completely. They were below me. I had climbed through 10,000 feet, expecting to find them above me, and they were below me. The fires they had already started were lighting them from underneath. I could see them perfectly. There were hundreds of them. I made one attack, and then the smoke was so thick I could not navigate. I landed and reported what I had seen, and no one believed me. Warrant Officer Saburo Saito, 10th Air Division Combat Report, March 10, 1945. Operation Meeting House, the March 9th to 10th, 1945 raid on Tokyo, remains to this day the single most destructive aerial bombardment in human history, in terms of immediate casualties. 279 B-29s dropped 1,665.5 tons of M69 incendiaries on the working-class neighborhoods of downtown Tokyo. The resulting firestorm created its own weather, generating ground-level winds of 28 miles per hour that pushed flames faster than people could run. 267,000 buildings were destroyed. An estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Japanese civilians died in a single night. Section 6. Firepower Deep Dive. To understand what the B-29 brought to the Pacific, you have to understand it as a system, not simply as a bomber, but as an integrated weapons platform unlike any that had existed before. The production B-29 carried a central fire control system, a network of 4 remotely operated gun turrets controlled by 5 gunners using analog fire control computers, the first operational use of such a system in any combat aircraft. The upper forward turret carried 4.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. The lower forward and upper rear turrets each carried 2.50 caliber weapons. The tail position mounted 2.50 caliber guns and a single 20mm cannon. Total defensive armament: 10.50 caliber machine guns with 200 rounds per gun, and one 20mm cannon with 100 rounds, a total of 2,100 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and 100 rounds of 20mm. The central fire control system represented a revolution in defensive gunnery. A B-29 gunner, seated in a pressurized sighting blister, could direct the fire of any turret on the aircraft to engage a single target. Multiple guns concentrating their fire simultaneously through a single gunner's computed sight. The radar system, added in late production models, could acquire and track targets in darkness or cloud cover. Rate of fire: the M2 Browning in aircraft configuration fired at 750 to 850 rounds per minute. 10 guns firing simultaneously produced a theoretical maximum output of 7,500 to 8,500 rounds per minute, though in practice, engagement time was measured in fractions of a second. Convergence: the fire control computers calculated convergence distances dynamically, adjusting for aircraft speed, target angle, and wind, calculations that a human gunner working manually would require minutes to perform. The computer did it continuously, in real time. The effect on Japanese fighter pilots was psychologically devastating. Captain Masao Itagaki, of the 244th Sentai, one of Japan's most skilled interceptor units, stationed at Chofu specifically to defend Tokyo, described what it was like to attack a B-29 formation after the fire control improvements were introduced. You would begin your approach, and the entire aircraft would seem to turn toward you. Not just one gun, all of them. The tracers came from multiple directions at once. It was not like attacking a bomber. It was like attacking a fortress that could move. I lost 3 men in my unit in 2 weeks to these gun systems. We began to question whether a head-on attack was even survivable. Captain Masao Itagaki, 244th Sentai, Post-War Testimony, United States Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. For comparison, The Mitsubishi A6M50, Japan's primary carrier-based fighter, carried two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns with 600 rounds each and two 20mm Type 99 cannons with 100 rounds each. Its rate of fire was less than a quarter of what a single B-29 gunner could bring to bear. The Nakajima Ki 84 Hayate, Japan's best land-based fighter of the final war years, was faster and harder hitting, but its pilots consistently reported that the B-29's defensive fire created approach corridors so dangerous that standard deflection shooting was nearly impossible. On the offensive side, against the M69 incendiary missions, a B-29 carried between 40 and 60 clusters of incendiaries, each cluster containing 38 individual bomblets. Between 1,520 and 2,280 individual incendiary devices per aircraft. Each bomblet, striking a target, would embed its felt pad into the material and then ignite, releasing napalm at approximately 1,000 degrees Celsius. One Japanese survivor described the effect with terrible precision. The bombs did not fall, they rained. Thousands of small flames, falling slowly, covering everything. The sound was not an explosion. It was a hiss, and then the hiss became a roar and there was no escaping it. Saruko Hoshino, civilian survivor of the March 9th to 10th Tokyo raid, testimony to the Tokyo Municipal Archives, 1950. Section 7. Industrial Might. The B-29 was the most expensive weapons program in American history. More expensive than the Manhattan Project, though the two were, of course, ultimately connected in ways no one yet fully understood in 1944. Total program cost $3.01 billion in 1945 money, approximately $51.3 billion in today's terms. Total aircraft produced 3,970 B-29s from 4 separate facilities. The 4 production facilities tell the story of American industrial mobilization. Boeing Plant 2, Renton, Washington. Primary design and initial production facility, 1,119 B-29s produced. The Renton facility covered 6.5 million square feet under one roof. Boeing Wichita, Wichita, Kansas, largest production facility by volume. 1644 B-29s produced. At peak production in early 1945, Boeing Wichita was completing one B-29 every 68 minutes of the working day. Bell Aircraft, Marietta, Georgia, 668 B-29s produced. The Marietta facility employed a workforce that peaked at 28,000, of which approximately 41% were women. Part of the broader mobilization that represented the single greatest transformation of the American labor market in the 20th century. Glenn L. Martin Company, Omaha, Nebraska, 536 B-29s produced. Martin's Omaha facility, converted from civilian production, employed 14,000 workers at peak. Each B-29 comprised approximately 55,000 individual parts, not counting fasteners. The fuselage alone required 35,000 rivets. The electrical system contained 7.3 miles of wiring. The aircraft incorporated 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each containing 56 individual spark plugs. 224 spark plugs per aircraft, along with 3,350 individual machined components per engine, manufactured to tolerances of 5/10,000ths of an inch. The supply chain was continental in scale. Aluminum from Pacific Northwest smelters, rubber seals from Akron, Ohio, gun barrels machined in Hartford, Connecticut, precision optics ground in Rochester, New York, flight instruments from Brooklyn. It was not one factory building a bomber. It was an entire nation, converted to a single purpose. Against this, Japan's aircraft production capacity was not simply smaller. It was fundamentally different in character. Japanese aircraft production in 1944 peaked at approximately 28,000 aircraft of all types. American production that same year was 96,318 aircraft. The ratio was roughly 3.4 to 1 in favor of the Americans, and the quality gap, in terms of the B-29 specifically, was almost incomprehensible. Japan produced no aircraft in its history that could match the B-29's range, altitude, or bomb load. Pilot training reflected this gap with brutal clarity. American B-29 crews received a minimum of 360 hours of flight training before their first combat mission, including 60 hours specifically in B-29s. Japanese fighter pilots in 1945 were receiving, on average, fewer than 100 hours of total flight training, down from the 500-plus hours that had made the 1941 carrier pilots so deadly. The reason was simple. Japan was running out of fuel. She was running out of aluminum. She was running out of time. I had 93 hours of total flight time when I was assigned to intercept the B-29s. I had never flown at night. I had never fired my guns at a moving target. They put me in a Key 4-3 and sent me up after aircraft flying at 10,000 meters. I was 20 years old. Most of the men I trained with did not survive the winter. Pilot Officer Keiko Nakamura, 18th Sentai, Post-War Deposition, 1947. Section 8. Campaign Statistics. The statistics of the B-29 campaign against Japan are staggering in their scale and almost incomprehensible in their human meaning. Total sorties flown against Japan by the 21st Bomber Command, 34,790. Total bomb tonnage delivered, 160,800 tons. Total aircraft lost to all causes, 414 B-29s. B-29s lost to enemy action, 147. Japanese aircraft claimed destroyed by B-29s in air combat, 974. Urban area destroyed, 178 square miles of Japanese cities, including Greater Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and 63 additional cities and towns. The campaign's most intensive phase began with Operation Meeting House on March 9th and continued through 5 major raids in 10 days that burned out the industrial hearts of Japan's 5 largest cities. By the end of March 1945, LeMay's command had dropped more bombs on Japan in 10 days than had fallen on Germany in the first 2 years of American involvement in the European War. Operation Meeting House, Tokyo, March 9th to 10th. 279 B-29s, 1,665.5 tons of incendiaries. 267,000 buildings destroyed. 15.8 square miles of Tokyo destroyed, the most densely populated area on Earth. Raid on Nagoya, March 11th to 12th. 285 B-29s, 1,790 tons. 2.05 square miles destroyed, including the Mitsubishi aircraft engine plant. Raid on Osaka, March 13th to 14th. 274 B-29s, 1,732 tons, 8.1 square miles destroyed, including the Kawasaki aircraft factory. Against this weight of fire and metal, Japanese ground defenses found themselves increasingly ineffective. The low-altitude night attacks had disrupted the calibration of anti-aircraft batteries designed for high-altitude targets. The volume of aircraft was beyond what Japanese radar networks could effectively track and direct fire against. General Masakazu Kawabe, commanding the Eastern District Army responsible for Tokyo's defense, filed a situation report on March 15, 1945, 5 days after. Operation Meeting House. The enemy's incendiary attack of the 9th demonstrated capabilities we have not previously encountered: the scale, the low altitude, the duration. Our fire control systems were not designed for this mode of attack. We destroyed 11 enemy aircraft. They destroyed 300,000 homes and killed 100,000 of our people. I have no tactical recommendation to offer that would significantly change this outcome. General Masakazu Kawabe, Eastern District Army, Situation Report, March 15, 1945. The campaign extended beyond urban areas. B-29s, fitted with radar and operating in small groups, conducted aerial mining operations that effectively closed Japan's coastal shipping lanes. Operation Starvation. The aerial mining campaign of 1945 saw B-29s from the 313th Bomb Wing lay 12,053 mines in 1528 sorties across the Shimonoseki Strait and other critical waterways. These mines sank or damaged 670 Japanese vessels, totaling 2.25 million tons of shipping, fully 9.3% of all Japanese shipping lost in the Pacific War, at a cost of only 15 B-29s. Section 9. Enemy Psychological Impact. The Japanese had a name for the B-29. and it was not a flattering one, and it was not the last name they would give it. In the early raids of late 1944, when the aircraft flew high and cold and were largely ineffective, Japanese civilians and military personnel alike called it B-san, Mr. B, a weirdly affectionate mockery, something large and slow and useless, lumbering across the sky at impossible heights, dropping bombs that fell uselessly in fields and forests. Mr. B, not threatening, almost comic. After Operation Meeting House, the nickname changed. The aircraft was increasingly called Hinotori, the Firebird, a reference to the mythological phoenix, but in this context entirely without the phoenix's regenerative meaning, just the fire. And then, as the summer of 1945 progressed, and city after city burned, a third name emerged in civilian usage: Shi no Tori, the Bird of Death. The trajectory of these three names, Mr. B to Firebird to Bird of Death, traces the arc of an entire nation's psychological collapse more precisely than any battle map. Japanese medical officers at major military installations began documenting a clinical phenomenon by May 1945. Soldiers stationed near cities that had been bombed exhibited symptoms that Japanese military psychiatrists classified as air raid terror syndrome. Symptoms included persistent insomnia, inability to work under clear skies due to anticipatory anxiety triggered by the same visibility that enabled bombing, severe startle responses to any aircraft engine sound, and a progressive dissociation from normal daily routines that military commanders described as a general failure of fighting spirit. This was not a classification of weakness. Japanese military culture was not disposed to acknowledge psychological casualties. The fact that they developed a clinical category for it at all indicates how widespread and undeniable the phenomenon had become. The Japanese intelligence assessments of the B-29 threat, when read in sequence, tell the story of a catastrophic miscalculation being corrected in real time, always too late. October 12, 1944, Assessment Number 7734-B. The B-29 is assessed to be a propaganda weapon of limited military utility. Its engine reliability is poor and its crews are undertrained. Threat level: moderate. February 1, 1945, Assessment Number 8912-A. Revising upward. The B-29 has demonstrated greater durability and range than initially assessed. The threat to home island industrial targets must be considered significant. Fighter defenses must be augmented. Threat level: high. March 15, 1945. Assessment Number 9103-C. The events of March 9th to 10th have altered our assessment fundamentally. The B-29, employing low-altitude night incendiary tactics, represents a threat for which we have no adequate defense. Our fighter arm, our anti-aircraft assets, and our civil defense infrastructure are all inadequate to the scale of the problem. Threat level: critical. June 22, 1945, Assessment Number 9447-D. The B-29 campaign has effectively destroyed the industrial capacity of the 6 major cities. 63 secondary cities have been targeted. Mining operations have compromised coastal shipping. There is no tactical or operational recommendation this office can make that would materially alter the strategic situation. Threat level: decisive. General Torishiro Kawabe, the Deputy Chief of the Imperial General Staff, would speak about the B-29 campaign to American interrogators after the war with a directness that contrasted sharply with the formalized language of the wartime assessments. We lost the war in the air. Not on the sea, not on the ground, in the air. And we lost it not because your pilots were braver than ours, we lost it because you had an aircraft we could not fight and a production system we could not match. The B-29 was not just a weapon, it was a demonstration that we had already lost before we knew it. General Torishiro Kawabe, Imperial Japanese General Staff, United States Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogation, November 1945. Section 10. The Atomic Missions. By the summer of 1945, the conventional B-29 campaign had already broken Japan's industrial backbone. But the aircraft had one final, civilization-altering role to play. The 509th Composite Group, based at Northfield on Tinian Island, had been operating in the Marianas since June 1945. Its aircraft flew strange solo missions over Japan, single B-29s, unescorted at high altitude, dropping single large bombs or nothing at all. Japanese radar operators tracked them. Japanese fighters were sometimes scrambled, but the 509th aircraft were always fast and always alone, and they seemed to drop nothing of significance. They were dismissed. At 8:15 and 17 seconds on the morning of August 6, 1945, at an altitude of 31,060 feet, over the city of Hiroshima, the Enola Gay's bombardier, Major Thomas Ferriby, released Little Boy, a gun-type uranium fission device weighing 9,700 pounds, with a yield equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. The weapon detonated 1,900 feet above the Aioi Bridge, 61 seconds after release. A city of 350,000 people ceased to exist as a functioning entity in 0.3 seconds. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the B-29 Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles W. Sweeney, dropped the Fat Man plutonium implosion device on Nagasaki. The yield was approximately 21,000 tons of TNT. A second city was destroyed in seconds. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcast his surrender rescript. In it, he referenced a new type of bomb, a most cruel bomb, as a factor in Japan's decision. He did not mention the conventional B-29 campaign, which had already burned 64 Japanese cities before the atomic weapons were used. In some sense, the atomic bombs were the final argument in a conversation that the B-29 had been making for 8 months, that there was no defense, no response, no tactical solution, no industrial answer to what America had built. Section 11. Legacy and Post-War Reflection. The formal surrender of Japan was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. Above the ceremony, flying in a vast, deliberate formation, were 462 B-29s from the 21st Bomber Command. The same aircraft, the same crews who had burned Japan's cities through the spring and summer. They flew in absolute silence from the perspective of those watching below. The roar of their engines a distant rumble, not the terror it had been for 8 months. Their presence was the punctuation mark on history's most expensive sentence. In 1949, 4 years after the war's end, a reunion was held at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, for veterans of the 73rd Bomb Wing. Among those present was Raymond Halloran, whose Rover Boys Express had survived Sergeant Cato's cannon rounds over Tokyo and been nursed home across 1,500 miles of open ocean. Also present, through arrangements made by the American occupation authorities in Japan, was Sergeant Fumio Kato himself, the key 4-4 pilot who had attacked Halloran's aircraft on January 27, 1945. The two men met in a conference room at the base. Their conversation, conducted through an interpreter, was brief and formal. Halloran showed Kato photographs of Rover Boys Express's damage. Kato studied them for a long time. He looked at the photographs for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he looked at me and he said through the interpreter, "I thought you were dead. I was sure you were dead." And I said, "I thought so too." We shook hands. There was nothing else to say. He was a soldier. We had both done what we were trained to do. Captain Raymond Halloran, speaking at the 73rd Bomb Wing 40th Anniversary Reunion 1985. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the most comprehensive after-action analysis of air power in history, interviewed hundreds of Japanese military and civilian officials in late 1945 and early 1946. The survey's conclusion regarding the B-29 campaign was measured but unambiguous. The conventional incendiary campaign had, by July 1945, reduced Japanese industrial output to approximately 25% of its 1944 peak. The mining campaign had cut coastal shipping by 57%. Without the atomic weapons, planners had projected that Japan would have faced famine conditions by the winter of 1945 to 1946. Among the survey's interview transcripts was a deposition from a ground-level intelligence officer whose name was not declassified for years. The passage became one of the most quoted summary assessments of the campaign. "We had no answer to the B-29. We studied it. We threw our best pilots against it. We built new fighter engines. We changed our tactics. Nothing was sufficient. It was not one aircraft that defeated us. It was the idea behind the aircraft, the idea that war could be industrialized, rationalized, made mathematical. That idea defeated us completely. Declassified Japanese Imperial Headquarters Intelligence Report, United States Strategic Bombing Survey Transcript File 447, J, 1946. Today, the Enola Gay hangs in permanent display at the National Air and Space Museum's Udvar Hazy Center at Dulles Airport in Virginia, fully restored in the center of the aviation hangar. It is the largest artifact in the Smithsonian Institution's collection. Every year, hundreds of thousands of visitors stand beneath it and look up. The aircraft is both beautiful and terrible, its aluminum skin polished to a mirror finish, its four R3350 engines still and silent. On the nose, in faded but still legible letters, painted in black, Enola Gay. Nearby, on a small placard, an excerpt from Japanese Intelligence Report File 447. J. Not the name of the officer who wrote it. Just the words, "We had no answer to the B-29. They called it Mr. B when it was harmless. They called it the fire bird when it burned their cities. They called it the bird of death when death was all it brought." From the beginning, the Japanese commanders reassured their men, "It is a paper dragon. It cannot sustain combat. It is a propaganda weapon. Look away." But the paper dragon did not look away. It came from factories the size of cities. It was built by women who had never worked a rivet gun in their lives, working 3 shifts, 7 days a week, in the name of something larger than any aircraft. It was flown by boys from Kansas and Ohio and Georgia who had never seen Japan and never would, except from 30,000 feet, or 9,000 feet in the firelit dark, or the impossible altitude of Hiroshima, where one bomb carried the weight of the entire industrial age. The B-29 Superfortress did not simply win the Pacific War. It changed what war meant. It demonstrated, in terms no nation could ignore, that industrial capacity is military strategy, that the factory floor and the assembly line are as decisive as the airfield and the fighter squadron, that in the industrial age, the nation with the greatest ability to design, produce, and replace was the nation that would prevail, regardless of the individual brilliance or sacrifice of the men on either side. Sergeant Watanabe, standing at his warning post in the Tokyo night in November 1944, heard something he could not identify. He was right to be afraid, for reasons his intelligence briefing could not explain to him. What he heard in that darkness was not merely an aircraft, it was an argument, a civilization's argument about what it meant to fight. The argument had already been won. It was only the counting of the dead that remained.